Welcome to All Home Care Matters, the show where we discuss all things home care, with discussions on important age-related matters and topics. Brought to you by Enriched Life Home Care Services, the #1 rated home care provider in Michigan by Top Rated Local.
Hello, and welcome back to All Home Care Matters. If this is your first time visiting us here at the show, we want to say thank you for taking time out to be with us today. We appreciate how valuable everyone's time is, and that's why we try and make each episode here at All Home Care Matters something that will hopefully matter to you. Today, we are honored to welcome author and daughter Andrea Couture, the author of Embracing What Remains. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you for having me.
So you wrote this remarkable memoir, Embracing What Remains, and it's about your father, who was a prominent surgeon, but he was diagnosed with dementia. What was that experience like for you as his daughter and, a younger child writing a memoir about a father or a parent with dementia? Did you have any preconceived notions about what dementia was prior to his diagnosis, or did you ever think you'd be writing a memoir about your father to begin with?
No. I think that, my dad's dementia diagnosis caught my whole family off guard in a very big way. My father was always very highly intelligent and almost brilliant. And so to have him diagnosed with something that was going to affect his mental capabilities was pretty devastating. The only experience I'd really had with dementia or Alzheimer's was my grandmother had it, his mother, and she had only passed away, I want to say 2 years before my dad's diagnosis. Wow. So it was sort of like a piggyback thing, and it was really shocking because my dad was only 67 when he was diagnosed. I never thought I'd write about my dad's life, but I'd always wanted to somehow honor his life, and I guess this was a great way to be able to do that.
So where was the moment for you, Andrea, when you decided, I need to write this story, I need to share this story? Was it more for your own self, like therapeutic reasons? Was it simply to honor his memory, or was it to say this is a story that other people need to know about? Or maybe it was a little bit of all of the above.
I think it was a combination of all of the things. I think when my dad was going through his disease, it just sort of started to strike me as something that I wanted to write about for like you said, my own catharsis, but also because his story was so interesting and unique to me that I felt like other people could benefit from hearing it, or it was just a truth I wanted to share with the world. And after talking with my mom, she said, I think you should share your father's story. I think that people need to know that this is happening, and it's happening to people like your dad, and it's okay to tell people, to help educate people on it.
Well, and I know, for some people that aren't familiar, becoming a surgeon is more than just becoming a doctor. You have, sometimes up to 12 years of postgraduate work or residency, if you will. And, we had shared an image last year that really struck a nerve with me and really hit home because, people look at, dementia and other illnesses as like, well, that person can't get it because they're a lawyer, they're a doctor. And, there was an image that was, created that said, even if the president of the United States, being Ronald Reagan, right, even if they are not immune to getting this, anybody can get it, and I think people have sometimes a hard time reconciling that this can affect anybody. There is no rhyme or reason. There's things you can do to keep your heart healthy. There's things to do to, lower the risk of, getting cancers. But with dementia, there are some things you can do, but, I'm sure your dad was a very healthy person. He's in the healthcare community. He's a surgeon. And yeah, it wasn't avoidable for him. Would you agree with that?
I would. I think that's part of the, what we're trying to do in this Alzheimer's dementia community is to kind of like lessen the stigma with it, that it only happens to certain people or that it can't happen to other people. I do think it's something that in some ways is almost unpreventable, like if preventing dementia means keeping your mind active, then what was my father do? I mean, his mind was so active because he was a surgeon and he was an administrator. I mean, he went beyond just the operating room. He was also in the business side of things. So I think that I think you can do what you can do for your body and your mind, but I don't know how much you really can prevent it. And that's probably what's scary about it,
Absolutely. And, we talk to a lot of authors and a lot of people who have, their personal stories. What is it about your story and your father's story that you found is maybe unique or different for caregivers and for the readers of the book?
I think it's a couple things. I think, first of all, was my father's career and how then he ended up having dementia and Alzheimer's. But also at the young age of 67, was his diagnosis. And also that I was only 37 when he was diagnosed, and I had a baby that year. So it was sort of like a couple different things of like my dad's interesting backstory, the way that his disease sort of progressed, and also how I was sort of in that sandwich generation of caring and worrying about my parents while also raising 3 young children, which, a lot of times, even before my dad was diagnosed, it was like, oh yeah, someone's dad has dementia or Alzheimer's, but this person's in their 50s or 60s. I was in my 30s, so I felt like it's not unheard of, but it is still not necessarily the norm.
Right. I would agree with that fully. Did you have any goals or hopes when you were in the middle of writing the book and ultimately publishing it?
Goals and hopes. I just hope that I could tell the story and someone else could read it who's sort of like me and say, wow, I'm not alone, because I wrote the story for myself because I was sort of looking for something to read that I could connect with. And I was like, well, if I share my story, I may be able to connect with other people. And I will say that I did meet that goal more than once, but especially a young woman reached out to me and she said, my dad is a surgeon. He just retired and he has dementia.
Wow.
And we connected, and it was like, we sometimes will message each other, here and there, checking in on each other. And it's like, we have the same story. And I think she was like, I'm so happy you shared your story. And ironically, she actually knew my father from Chicago. So it was sort of like twofold, but yeah.
That's incredible. What's some of the feedback from some of your family? Did you have any pushback? Because, sometimes families are like, you shouldn't do that, let him be remembered in this way, or let my mother be remembered in that way. Did you have any pushback from families or any, proceed with caution?
No, I mean, like I said, I asked my mom permission to write my father's story and our story, and she was all for it. And she read the whole thing before it was published, along with my sisters. They were the people's opinions I cared about the most in my family. Obviously, I couldn't get my dad's opinion, but my mom was my dad's sounding board. Like my mom spoke for my father. And so I said, if mom approves, then dad would approve. And I had no pushback from anybody. Everybody was really supportive. I think, my sisters were a little timid because we are a very private family. But I had the full support of my husband, my kids, my parents, my mom, and my in-laws. So it was really nice to have that.
For the family that had read it and didn't get to read it prior to, like, you shared it with your mother before it was released, what was some of the feedback they gave you?
Well, one of my sisters read it before it was released, and she was like, I love it. It's great. My other sister read it after, and she also loved it. I think she had a couple things where she was like, well, maybe not this, but not enough to say, take it off the shelf or whatever. And my in-laws did read a chapter that I wrote about them prior to publication. So I wanted them to see it, but everybody was very touched for the most part and happy. And I think it helped them too. I think for my mom, especially, it was cathartic for her.
Good.
I said things she didn't remember. I said things that she didn't know about. And it really helped her process, going through this with my dad and then eventually losing him. Yeah.
So you had some healthcare awareness, just being, through osmosis with your dad being a surgeon. Did you have any preconceived notions about dementia and Alzheimer's prior to his diagnosis? I know you said your grandmother had it. what were some of your thoughts, and how did those change through your journey with your dad?
Yeah, so my grandmother had it, but she was diagnosed in her 80s
Okay.
and then passed away at 89 with it. So hers was sort of short, but then much later in life. And I didn't have a lot of experience with her with it because I didn't see her too much when she had it. And so it was when I did visit her, some of it could just be like, well, she's getting older, so she doesn't talk as much, or she needed help, in the bathroom, or needed help with eating. But I didn't necessarily correlate that with her disease. It was also like her age. So I wasn't really fully aware. And it was, I was also much younger at the time. With my dad, when he was diagnosed, I immediately got on the internet. I was like looking it up, like what is going to happen? Because I think most people would say, oh, he won't remember your name, or he'll forget where his keys are, or, but I didn't realize to the extent that it would be that his language would cease, like he would stop talking, and that he would then physically really debilitate, to the point where he would no longer walk and would need help with everything. And so I think the biggest, misconception was that it was only going to affect his cognition, but it also affected him very physically.
Yeah. Yeah. What advice would you give to viewers or listeners who may be going through this right now with a parent or even a spouse, and they just kind of feel lost?
I mean, I think finding a support group, and however you can, whether it's in person or on the phone. My mom did a phone call one every week. I think you just need to talk about it, because I think that, in some ways it's very traumatic for people to process this and to experience it as a caregiver, especially. You need to talk with other people to not only feel less alone, but to get advice on things, like, how did you handle this when it happened? Because I think some people get frustrated and they're like, I don't even know how to deal with it. And sadly, I feel like the healthcare industry doesn't really know how to guide us either. And so
Right.
we guide each other, as caregivers. And so I would say, if you're a reader, go to AlzAuthors and check out the books. If you're a talker, find a support group, start a support group. You'd be surprised how many people are out there, and just talk with your family members about it. Because if you keep it to yourself, or you don't share your story with other people, I think it just is going to affect the caregiving, in many ways.
And I want to just kind of piggyback on something you said a moment ago when your dad was first diagnosed and you were going on the internet and kind of searching things.
Mm-hmm.
Would you still recommend that today?
I would, for the physical side of things, research the symptoms and the stages, and go to a trusted site like Mayo Clinic, or someone that is very trusted in the medical community, like whether it's a hospital website or, Alzheimer's Association or the foundation. I'm sure AlzAuthors also has some resources on that. I do think it's important, because I think we lack, the information. I don't know where else you would get it necessarily
Right.
quickly. And,
Well, and you keyed in on it. The trusted sources, because,
Yeah.
I know with us with the show, I mean, we've had people wanting to advertise and sponsor and do all this, economical, opportunities for us. And we always reject it because, some of them are, they have this new pill. It's not FDA approved. It's not real. It's going to cure Alzheimer's. Or, if you do this, new age, yoga, it's going to reverse all symptoms. And, when you're vulnerable and you're in a situation of almost desperation, people get taken advantage of, right? And that's what, we just so admire and support the incredible work that you and AlzAuthors are doing, because, everything has been vetted, right? You're an AlzAuthor, your book is part of the collection, but it wasn't like Amazon. You can just put it up there and it's automatically there, right? There's a process to make sure that all the information is vetted and it's authentic and real, which I think goes a long way in helping these families as well.
I agree. And I think that, we're very careful with the advice that we do give.
Right.
that it's not so much about like how to cure it or make it better. It's just how to get through it.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
and we really do focus more probably on the mental and emotional side of things. You know, we're not healthcare providers, we're not nurses and doctors. So, you know, that's something to think about. But I think if you're just wondering, like, what are the stages, you know, like what's going to happen to my loved one or what could, I think that's important to educate yourself and be prepared
Right.
for what's coming.
If you don't mind sharing, Andrea, what during your experience, what did you find the most helpful for you?
Ooh, I think probably just talking about it and finding like-minded people and people in my situation, or I don't know, like what was the most helpful? Probably writing my book, you know, starting to write it, starting to journal about it was sort of the first step for me. I think not avoiding the feelings I was having and not denying what was going on. I do think denial is a big stage for some caregivers. It's like, oh, this isn't really happening, or it's going to get better. But I think just, you know, and just I tend to express my emotions to people pretty openly. And that really helped me, was just to talk about it when I could. And, you know, check in with my mom and make sure that she knew that I was there for her and that we were like a team. I don't know. It's just such a complicated, long process that you kind of just have to take it one day at a time.
Sure. And so you had this reader who, you know, reached out to you, who has a similar situation that you shared with her father also being a surgeon and recently diagnosed. Were you able to give her any advice?
Yeah. So she's told me one night, she's like, we're going out. And I said, you know what, just enjoy it. I was like, and take pictures, you know, like, because that's something, you know, once they're gone, you're not gonna, if you don't document, you know, your time together, you know, you have to live in the moment. And sort of like, I hate to say lower your expectations, but maybe just don't have any expectations of a situation. And then you may just find that tiny little bit of joy
Right.
in it, you know. I think a big part of processing Alzheimer's and dementia is sort of changing your expectation of your loved one.
Mhm.
And not assuming they're going to be the same person they were a few years ago, or, you know.
Right. Right. Did you have anybody like she had with you? Did you have anybody that, you know, reached out to you or that you found a commonality with who had gone through it that may have been a support or help for you or for your family?
I started sharing the fact that my dad had Alzheimer's before I wrote my book a little bit on social media, like on Facebook, you know, privately with, you know, my friends. And I had a friend from college reach out to me and she said, you know, my dad had that and he actually passed away a couple of years ago. If you ever need anything, you know, let me know. But that was the first person that sort of reached out to me in like my own peer group. But even then I was like, I don't even know what to say to her. I don't know what to ask because I'm not really in the thick of it yet.
Right.
But that was really kind for her to reach out and not only check on me, but to tell me that it had happened to her. And it did make me feel a little bit like, wow, okay, maybe I'm not totally alone in this, but still, I mean, she didn't live near me or anything. So,
Right. Well, and I think too, you know, with a dementia diagnosis, sometimes, you know, and it's been called the long goodbye, you know, in different names because it is sometimes a long process. It could be 12 to 20 years even. How would you say that grieving or that grief process is different than, say, somebody who was diagnosed with a different illness or a different disease that maybe has, you know, a very short lifespan with the diagnosis?
well, I think it's a couple things. You know, if somebody is diagnosed with a disease that's treatable or curable, you know, the focus tends to be on their treatment and, okay, we're going to get them better. And we're going to, you know, spend all this time like cheering them on and staying positive. But I think you know, not the problem, but the challenge with dementia is there is no cure and
Right.
it is a terminal illness. And so your grieving process becomes how to process losing them slowly and knowing that there will be no turnaround. There will be no, you know, cure. And we're not fighting for them to, you know, survive. We're just fighting for them to go through this process with grace and dignity. And so it is so different to, and I think I'll write about this in a second book, is how when you raise a child, you're raising them to move on and survive. And, my father's the only person I've ever been that close with that has died. And so I was helping him die, essentially, like, how do you almost walk someone through that? And so there's just a lot of grief. There's the idea of them losing their faculties, but then also like their physical abilities. And so it's just, I don't know, you have to have a different mindset, because it's not about getting them better. It's just about, I guess, keeping their dignity, and you're maintaining a relationship in some way that still feels positive.
And it's that anticipatory grief, right? Where you just, it's always hanging there. People have said it feels like every day you're saying goodbye every day, and that for some people have, shared with us that they found that the most emotionally tolling, because they're still trying to be there and support that person, still, keep them, safe, and let them still feel respected and keep that dignity. But internally they're just saying goodbye constantly. And they said it was such an internal struggle between those two aspects that it was emotionally and mentally exhausting to them. Did you experience anything like that?
Yeah, I think, like I said before, the expectations change big time. It's like, okay, my dad and I aren't going to have this like, intense relationship anymore. We're having these like crazy conversations and really getting into life. It's going to be like, okay, my dad gave me a smile today and that was enough, And so I definitely changed the way I saw that. And I started to really appreciate the little things from him. If he made me laugh, if I made him smile, like that was a day, that was a good day. So yeah, it's like, wow, you really do a huge turnaround, in your relationship typically. At least we did, not everybody does, but it was definitely a big change like that. A lot of accepting, and yeah.
With your dad being so, respected, what was some of the feedback you received from some of his coworkers? Anything that really stood out, that, or like a fond memory or something they shared with you?
From his life, like his career, or knowing this information?
Either or.
Well, so my dad, because he retired prior to his diagnosis, we had like the retirement parties. And then we had, he received an award maybe a couple of years into retirement. So, and my dad was sort of always getting things like this. And so people are always speaking about my dad to me, or in public. And so I always heard wonderful stories about my dad. But after his retirement, it was just, he went back to where he got his medical degree and he received an award. And people were talking about him as a young doctor and a young surgeon. And that was just really cool to hear, because I always heard about my dad later in his career. But to hear about him sort of starting out and how he was kind of like crazy and like lots of like hair everywhere and just like, all this stuff falling out of pockets. Like, I don't know. It just, I loved hearing that about my dad. And just how well respected he was, and how people would say things like, he was a great doctor, but he was also a great man. Like, he was a great person. And he always wanted to help everybody. He had a social worker on his team. And he's reached out to me a couple of times and just said the most caring things, like, your dad stood up for everybody. He wanted everybody to succeed on the team. It wasn't just the other doctors or even the patients. It was also people like social workers. And, he really cared about the people he worked with and for, and his patients.
That's wonderful. Did any of the colleagues or people on his team, have they read the book?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I can't even tell you how many people have read that book that knew my dad. I think everybody wanted to read it because they wanted to know what happened after, he left, work, or when he was diagnosed. I've had so many nurses read it. My dad and his nurses were very close. Like, he treated his nurses so well. So much respect for, mutual respect for each other. I've had colleagues that my dad worked with when he was, a young doctor, an older doctor. So many have read it. I've had medical students, residents read it and reach out to me. And everybody has had such wonderful feedback that it really just validated me in sharing his story, whether it was thank you for telling us, or I'm so sorry you went through this, or, wow, your dad just, amazed me with this story, or we really miss him, just like a lot of nice, things. And I even had one doctor reach out to me who read it, and he said, I want to start sort of like a mission to educate other doctors in this dementia world about themselves, and when we can talk about it when we're doctors, and maybe when we should retire, when we should recognize it in ourselves and each other. So it's changing, even that, which seems pretty cool.
That is very cool. Well, and that leads to this question, Andrea. What would you be doing now if you hadn't wrote the book?
Wow. So, but my dad still had dementia and Alzheimer's?
Let's say it never happened.
Never. I honestly have no idea.
Okay, let's say, what would you be doing if he did get the diagnosis, but you hadn't wrote the book?
I kind of wanted to go to nursing school. I've always wanted to be a nurse. And I wonder if I would have, come to think of it, if my dad hadn't been diagnosed with dementia and Alzheimer's, I probably would have pursued that. But that all was happening at the same time. And I sort of backed off from the education to kind of focus on spending time with my dad, continuing to raise my children. And I think it was probably the right choice for me.
But now, in a way, you're doing the educating.
I know. And I'm still doing the nurturing, and like in some ways we did nurse my dad. There was a lot of, because he stayed home through the course of his disease, we did physically care for him quite a bit. And so, I kind of saw that side of things more than necessarily taking care of a child. I mean, he was a patient, he was someone who needed healthcare. So I think that sort of showed me a different side of life. And so I kind of did it all, I suppose.
Well, and, when we previously spoke, and this has stood out quite a bit for me, you said, and I don't remember the phrase you used, but essentially you're saying for you, it was maybe interesting, it's not the word, but you said it, you described it, and you'll maybe be able to fill this blank in, but, your dad went from being the one putting on the white coat, putting on the scrubs, putting on the, the medical gloves, to now you guys were taking over that role for him.
Right.
Share that experience.
Yeah. So one of the first things that happened that made me really want to write my dad's story was he was at the point where he couldn't really dress himself anymore. He could still walk, and we were about ready to go outside for a walk, and it was winter. It was cold. And I was putting on his coat, and then I was putting his hat on him, and I was helping him put on his gloves. And I was like, this is so weird. This feels like I'm a nurse dressing my dad as a surgeon for the operating room, yet he can't really participate. So I'm doing it for him, but I'm doing it because he has dementia, and I'm doing it as his daughter. And it just felt like this weird parallel universe. Like, how is he processing this? Yeah. And the fact that he had put on gloves how many times in his life, and he now couldn't do it. It was just like, I have to write about this. Like, it's so poignant. It was fascinating to me that this was sort of where we were going. And then with the pandemic, we started wearing masks around my dad. And I was like, is he so confused right now? But then I was like, but at the same time, he spends so much of his time behind a mask talking to other people behind masks. Maybe it's not that hard for him to read my eyes and still hear my voice and not be able to see my lips when I speak, which I do think is a big thing for some people with dementia and Alzheimer's, is that they don't, they need to see someone's face and their mouth. But maybe my dad had a little bit of a benefit that he spent a lot of his time already doing that. I don't know.
It might even have been helpful for him. Just a level of comfort, because,
it's true. Or was he just like, where am I?
Well, yeah.
I don't know.
So what are you doing? We asked, what you would have done if you hadn't wrote the book, or if your dad hadn't received the diagnosis, but he had, and you did write the book. What is it that you're doing now?
Now, so my dad passed away almost a year ago. And so I thought, I started writing before he, so my book ends, I don't know if it's a spoiler, but my book ends before my father passes away. And that was on purpose. I wanted to end the book like that. But then I thought, there is a lot more of his story to share. And I think some of it is important for people to hear or want to know. So I did start writing more. I may publish that. I sort of have finished it. I'm also working a lot with AlzAuthors. And so I'm on the acquisitions team. So we get the book submissions, then we read them, and then we work with the other authors, to get that out into the media. I'm doing some, speaking. I was at St. Michael's College in Vermont last week talking about my dad's diagnosis and speaking on behalf of like loved ones and caregivers, along with Alzheimer's Association member there, and also a scientist who is working at St. Michael's, which is really interesting to with spiders and how their brains are very similar to mice, which then also correlate to like the human brain. And so she's been doing some amazing discoveries there. And she's actually going to be funded by the NIH to continue her work. So I'm just sort of getting my hands in everything, like I've been helping another friend like develop a book. So I don't know.
It's exciting.
Sort of seeing where it takes me.
It's exciting. Your next book, what would be the premise around it? What would you want it to focus on?
About my dad, like if I continue that.
Yeah, would you pick it up after, where this one ends at, or would it be a totally different direction?
It's very similar the way I wrote it, but also, so my first book is sort of like reads like a novel, like you're kind of going through the process with me. If I publish this one, it's going to be more like a reflections book where I'll be reflecting on something that will have happened and sort of how I'm processing it at the time. It's more in real time. My memoir is more of like this happened and now I'm talking about it. So I don't really know, but it will walk you through the rest of my dad's life and then somewhat after he passes away.
Well, we'll have to have you back when you write it.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most needed right now, though, in the Alzheimer's and dementia community? If you had to put your finger on one or two things, what would those be for you?
I just think, when your loved one gets the diagnosis, for my family at least, it felt like the support structure really wasn't there in the medical community. And it's not that they didn't want to do it, it's that they didn't have the resources. I don't know how it's like in other states, but New Hampshire, it seems to be lacking a little bit, where it was like, okay, he has dementia, or then he has Alzheimer's. Good luck. It was like, well, what do we do? And it's like, well, there's nursing home option or assisted living, or but there wasn't really like, these are the support groups and this is how you should care for him. It seemed like we were kind of just left floating out there. And so I feel like, like other diseases and illnesses, we need just more education when someone's diagnosed and sort of how to help them and care for them. And then just more support structure in terms of like mental and emotional help for caregivers. I think that's so important. We're so focused on the person with dementia, but what about the people caring for them?
Right. Absolutely.
I think that's really important.
And I know you've kind of mentioned them. We've mentioned several things that I think are positive takeaways from your experience. But if you can come up with two or three, what would you say are your top two positive experiences from your caregiving journey with your father?
I think I got to know my dad in such a different light. And I feel like in some ways it really was such a gift to be able to care for him. My dad and I were never like that daughter and father who were like always like hugging and like, physically close. And I got to sort of do that with him as he progressed in his disease. And that was such a nice connection to have because he could no longer speak. So to be able to hold his hand or, rub his arms or his feet, as he was, progressing in his disease was a really special for me. I just think, I don't know, like, I think my family got closer through the disease. We shared more of our emotions with each other. And we just learned that even though my father was he was such a giant to us in so many ways, I think we thought we would never be able to exist without him. And for it to be such a slow progression, we realized like, okay, we can do this without him. We don't want to, but we can. And it was almost like this gentle, I don't know what you want to say, pulling away, where he gave us that strength as he was, leaving us, that we would be okay without him.
He was preparing you for it.
Yeah. It wasn't like this immediate, like I'm gone. And I think that we needed that. And I think that that's where this disease was a gift for us, is that it was a slow goodbye where we could slowly, realize that, I don't know, we take what we've learned from him and what we've, gotten from him over the years to just give us that strength to go on,
What do you think, what would you think your dad would be most interested in knowing about now that he's gone, but his story is being shared widely like it is?
Yeah. I think, I would hope, that he would be okay with this. But one of my dad's most important things in his career was teaching medical students. He loved it. I mean, he won like Professor of the Year a couple of times. And so in this, if you look at it, we're educating people about a medical issue. And so we're continuing that legacy for him. And I feel like he would say, okay, I'm okay with that. You're continuing what I always loved to do, which was educate people in the medical community about medical issues. And also, that colleague of his that wants to help other doctors, I feel like my dad would say, okay, I've made a difference. My disease may, carve a path or chart a path for these doctors following in my footsteps, to open that conversation about dementia and Alzheimer's in the physician community,
Furthering it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what about you personally? Aside from the book and, going on different shows and things, how are you furthering your father's legacy? Are there other ways that you're doing that?
I just think, probably just talking about Alzheimer's and dementia in a more open way, trying to change or lessen the stigma with it, helping others. Like I'm not in the medical community, but I feel like I am still helping other people. And so in that, I feel like that's continuing my dad's legacy, to help other people. And I don't know, help other people not succeed, but at least feel like they're not alone in this. And if that's what I can do, then that's what I can do.
It's wonderful. Last question, Andrea. Where would you like people to go to purchase the book? And we will put that up on the website.
You can go to AlzAuthors.com and find my book there, or it's on Amazon also. It's in Kindle and paperback. So however people like to read. I would love to do an audio version sometime, but I haven't done it yet.
Okay. And how about if they want to reach out to you personally? Do you have an email for contacting you?
I do. So my email is my full name. So it's Andrea, Andrea Couture, COUTURE.author@gmail.com. People can find me there.
Perfect. Well, we just want to say thank you for sharing your story, your father's story, and your family's story. And we send all of our best to you and your family and to your mother. And thank you so much for what you're doing to help, raise awareness and show people that, they're not alone. I think that's very important. So we appreciate it. And we'll have you back on when you have your next book out.
Okay. Thank you, Lance.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for joining us today here at All Home Care Matters. All Home Care Matters is here to help families as they navigate these long-term care issues. We invite you to visit us at allhomecarematters.com, where there's a private, secure, fillable form where you can give us feedback, show ideas, or if you have questions. Every form is read and responded to. And remember, you can listen to the show on any of your favorite podcast streaming platforms or watch the show on our official YouTube channel. Just make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. We'd also like to say thank you again to Andrea Couture for joining us today to discuss her book, Embracing What Remains. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next time here at All Home Care Matters.
Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us again on another episode of All Home Care Matters. To learn more about the show and to connect with us, visit us at allhomecarematters.com.